what I'd like to do is, this is sort of a pretentious title on purpose. I'm a pretentious guy, I guess. And that is reflect a little bit on the future, not so much on happiness specifically, but the context within which we will seek happiness. And this is what I've been looking at for the past couple of years. So my field is how organizations, whether they're large corporations or governments, or entrepreneurs, try to innovate. So that's where I've spent the last 25 years of my life. But the last 2 years I've been thinking a different thought, which is where might the world go the rest of the 21st century? Literally that sort of horizon. In business, society, but also, as I'm referring to it, being human. The experience of being human in many ways will change. In some ways will remain the same, but in many ways will fundamentally shift. So this is a topic I'm exploring with colleagues like Mohan Surf at Northwestern, neuroscientists there, and David Krakauer at the Santa Fe Institute, and John Clippinger at Media Lab, and a bunch of us have been talking about these issues. I'll be in Berlin in a couple of weeks to talk to a group of people. I'm interested in reaching out to Dubai and other places to find out what they're seeing. Not so much about happiness, but about how the world might change over the next few generations. So what I'd like to do here is just give you a few thoughts, things I've been thinking about for the past couple of years. Not a lot of answers, but more framing for our common future. The first two will be opportunities and challenges, because the two always go together. And the third one will be sort of a recommendation. So the first one, abundance and hyper-transparency. So for all of human history, and I, as an academic, rarely use the word all or every, but for all of human history, we have evolved within a context of scarcity and opacity, meaning a scarcity of resources for life, a fight for resources, and opacity meaning a blind-like ability to see through things, almost nothing apparent to us. The fundamental transition of the rest of this century will be toward abundance, which many others are talking about. I'll come back to that. But also to something I'm calling hypertransparency. I'll come back to that as well. So Singularity University, Matt mentioned them. I'm a big fan. I love those guys. I'm a modest investor, and then through a syndicate here in Miami, in fact. I'm sometimes concerned, though, because they're often boosterish. Like, everything's going to be great. I sort of start to feel like the Lego movie. You know, everything's great when you're part of a team sort of thing. Now, I am an optimist who also tries to be critical. And so I do believe, we don't have time to talk about it now, there will be extraordinary challenges we face as a result of these changes. But I believe as well that they are right about abundance. Peter Diamandis, Ray Kurzweil are right about abundance. By the end of this century, energy will be free, or nearly so. We can argue about the science of this later if you're interested, but energy will be free or nearly so. And what do we need to create things like virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, computation, all this stuff we're talking about? Well, we need computational capability and we need energy. So these two things will unlock a whole range of experiences for the experience of being human, including what I'm referring to as hypertransparency. Now, I take this notion of hypertransparency from a French philosopher named Jean Baudrillard, and if you aren't familiar with him, look him up. He died in 2007. But he was predictive of many of the things we're seeing today, even in odd ways, predictive of fake news back in the 1980s when he started to work on the notion of hyper-reality. Reality created and not based on any sort of real underlying concept, symbols and simulacra, as he mentioned. So the reason I use the word hyper-transparency is over the rest of this century, we will actually be able to see deeper and deeper, more deeply into almost everything. Think about Internet of Things. Think about sensor networks. Think about some of the examples you've seen here today of biofeedback mechanisms that we're able to create. In fact, it goes much further than this. 10 years ago, neuroscientists were arguing about whether it would be ever possible to view people's dreams while they were having them. Literally connect directly to the brain to see the visuals that are going on inside a person's brain. Today, we all know it's true because it's already happened. Now, we're seeing dreams and they're fuzzy. You know it's a tree. You're not quite sure what kind. You see a couple people. You're not really sure what they're doing, but will it get better? Of course it will. So in the course of our lifetimes, we will be able to see more deeply into the brains of each other to understand more about ourselves than we already do currently. The notion of volition, for instance, we all think when we raise our hand it is because we thought cerebrally, I would like to raise my hand, but in fact science is showing us that there is a part of your brain that activates before you consciously recognize that you have decided to raise your hand. And we're not entirely sure what this means in terms of free will and volition and all those issues. So as we move into a context of hyper-reality, it's hyper because many of the things are what we would traditionally consider real, the external world. And we don't have time to have the philosophical conversation about this, but I would love to with anyone interested. So the external, objective, real world, but now with virtual reality, augmented reality, today we can tell when it's not real. You can take the headset off and exit the experience. But over the next generation or so, it will come to the point where the only way you will know you are not in a quote-unquote real experience, and I'll come back to that, is that you will know you are not in a real experience, because we will be able to provide the data inputs directly to your brain that are identical to those that you are getting currently from the outside world. There is no law of physics that prevents us from doing this. And this is something Moran Cerf and I call the invisible interface. So today, we're all excited about voice interfaces, and by the way, isn't it fun to confuse Alexa? That's really exciting. So we're using voice interfaces. Before we had keyboards. Now everybody's excited about gestures or eye movements. In our lifetimes, we'll eliminate all of that because the interface will be direct with the human brain. This will unlock a whole lot of opportunities, including something else that Mohan and I call eye-to-eye communications. Eye-to-eye communications are intelligence-to-intelligence communications. This means in communication directly from my brain, my volition, my brain to yours, or from my brain to a piece of artificial intelligence, or some combination thereof. A lot of people argue about issues like, will the robots win? Will there be some sort of conflict, global conflict? And fortunately, the movies tell us that Arnold Schwarzenegger will run in, and for some reason, he has a love interest in the movie. I don't know how that's relevant. But in any case, he'll swoop in, and through human creativity and love, he'll save the day, and the robots will die. Well, this is ridiculous, because the robots will be us. All of these technologies will be integrated with us directly. It won't be an us and them. It will be us and us. So abundance and hypertransparency, and let me underscore why this is so important to ponder, and that is, again, for all of human history, we have existed in a context of scarcity and opacity. And over this century, we will transition to a context of abundance and hypertransparency, a context within which no human political, economic, faith-based, cultural system has ever existed. We have no proof points, no context within which to recognize how to operate within this emerging context. We already have some early signs that it won't all be peaches and cream. As we evolved in this context of scarcity, we evolved in order to eat as much fat and sweet as possible, because if you don't eat when there's food on the table, you die. Many of us today, not all of us, exist in a context of abundance. We can eat whenever we like. And thus, we're experiencing a global epidemic of obesity and diabetes. This is a reflection of the transition from scarcity to abundance. We will face more and more challenges like this over the remainder of this century. The king-customer paradox, number 2. I'm going to do this one briefly, but it's something that occurred to me over the past few months preparing for an event for The Economist. And the panel I was on had to do with the customer is becoming king. Now, we've heard of this, or queen, we've heard of this for many years, and business is all about the customer is always right, and data allows us to understand what your internal needs and interests are before you even understand you have them. By the way, Amazon is already doing something called anticipatory shipping. Anticipatory shipping literally is they're watching your online behaviors, what you're clicking on, what you're lingering on. In fact, there's something called cursor hover time, where you keep going back to that thing your wife told you you shouldn't buy, but you're probably going to buy it anyway, so you keep going back and you're hovering on it. We call it digital drooling. Amazon is watching this, and they send the product to the distribution center near you before you've even ordered that product. Now, this isn't just some general demand planning. This is looking at you, Rob Wolcott, lingering on that product and sending that product near your house before you even ordered it. So yes, the customer is becoming king, and everyone will attempt to serve you in more and more granular and detailed ways, but the metaphor of king is far more powerful than we expected. With power comes responsibility and risk. Remember, as a king or a queen, you have legions of people attempting to serve you, attempting to please you. Legions of people being obsequious to try and understand how to get under your skin. Legions of people doing things on your behalf, whether you want them to or not, whether you know they are doing so or not. And the same thing will happen increasingly to us as we are consumers and customers, where we will have legions of obsequious organizations attempting to please us and doing things that we're not even aware they're doing. The customer truly will become king in all the wonderful and horrible ways about it. It reminds me of an experience with my daughter. I have two daughters, Jolie and Sage. Sage is 6, and we had just gotten done reading at bedtime, one of my favorite moments of the day, reading a bedtime story. And of course, the story was about a princess and a prince, and at the end of the story, you know what happens, right? I don't even have to read the story to you. They get married. And my 6-year-old named Sage, which by the way in French means wise, and it turns out to be a great choice for her, she looked at me and she said, "Daddy, what happens next?" And I said, "That's a really good question, honey. I really have no idea." "What does happily ever after mean?" And I said, "Sage, every time in your dating life, I want you to always think about that question." Finally, a bit of a recommendation for all of us: attention. Attention is our most limited resource. The most limited resource of any organization is the attention of our best people, by far. It's not capital, it's attention. William James, the great philosopher and a founder of modern psychology, went so far as to say that attention equals belief. Not that attention affects belief, but equals belief. And the first time I read it, I recoiled, and I thought, what, this guy is just making a rhetorical statement, and I realized later he was entirely right. On what we pose our attention affects what we believe, creates what we believe, and what we believe creates on what we place our attention. To what do we attend? One of the most essential and ethical decisions that you make every moment of the day is on what do we pay attention. Now, we have a lot of organizations and people trying to throw things at us, blinking lights, moving stuff online to distract us, to fragment our attention, to decrease our ability to think and meditate, meditative thinking as opposed to calculative thinking. And it's our job to have the responsibility to identify on what we attend. But I also want to point out that it is not obvious and cannot be answered for you by me or anyone else. So, of course, it's wonderful to focus our attention on things like saving whales and helping children, and we'll all agree those are wonderful things, and we should attend to them. But who's to say in this experience of life that I'm from Chicago, the Chicago Cubs won the World Series last year. I mean, I still feel odd saying that. Who's to say that to spend the time to attend to this extraordinary once-in-a-hundred-and-some-year experience is not a wonderful thing to do? It is ultimately all about the experiences we have together, and through this transition to abundance and hyper-transparency, building together a world in which our children and our grandchildren will be happy to live. Thank you very much for your time.